In part 1, we went over how 2 state laws are attempting to navigate our state and region out of the current housing crisis. But how did we get here? Let's go to the timeline. Between 1629 and 1686, it's difficult to get a clear picture of just how many Native Americans originally lived in this area and how exactly the white European colonizers came to occupy the land called Lynn under the English crown. However, it is clear through historical records that the land most likely was not acquired through a mutually beneficial arrangement. It is also unclear as to how many colonizers lived here through the 1700s, though there are accounts calling it a modest fishing village. Throughout the 1800s, large resorts were built in the area now known as Swampscott, which attracted wealthy patrons and residents. In 1852, Swampscott was separated from Lynn due to different business interests, and that they wanted to remain as a town form of government and not a city. In 1857, a small section of Salem was annexed, bringing the town to its current physical size of 3.05 square miles in area, and that's really where the story of our town's density starts. Swampscott's population and housing grew significantly from its founding in 1852 until about 1930, with growth ranging from 20 to over 40% decade after decade. Most of this growth came from building new single-family houses with space for a carriage on parcels that had been defined since at least 1897. Between 1930 and 1950, though, population and housing growth slowed significantly, probably due to 2 factors. First, an early version of a zoning bylaw known as tenement control was put in place in Swampscott and several other communities around the state, which made it impossible to build a housing option known as the triple-decker that had become especially popular with immigrant populations. This was an explicit attempt to ensure that immigrant populations stayed in cities like Lynn and didn't come to Swampscott. The second factor that probably contributed to slowed housing growth was the Great Depression, which started in 1929 and was compounded with the start of World War II. The New Deal and the GI Bill after the war, as well as the increase of car ownership in the 1950s, got the population growth moving again, and along with it came housing growth and new home ownership opportunities, at least for those that were white. African Americans and others of color were denied the opportunity to buy homes or even get a loan to do so in both the New Deal as well as the GI Bill, especially in areas that are already mostly white as the result of explicitly racist laws and policies. This, of course, led to a home ownership boom amongst the white population, especially in the suburbs, and homes became a great way to build generational wealth. But again, this opportunity was not given to everyone else. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed to get rid of the explicitly racist laws. And then the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 to state that, hey, we also meant housing when we said you can't discriminate based on race. But by this time, communities had started developing zoning bylaws, which while they didn't explicitly deny people of color the ability to live in certain communities, they artificially limited the housing supply by creating minimum lot sizes and restricting the number of units that could be built on a lot so only those that had accumulated a certain amount of wealth could get in. This is called exclusionary zoning. In Massachusetts, we passed the Comprehensive Permit Act of 1969. This is commonly known as 40B. The state took a look at all these new exclusionary zoning bylaws and said, again, we see what you're doing, and gave developers a way to get around some of those zoning restrictions. Ironically, Swampscott's last resort, the new Ocean House, which had over 500 rooms and hosted around 45,000 guests every summer season, burned down this same year and was never rebuilt. In its place, you can now find a handful of single-family detached houses along with a few townhomes. From the 1960s through today, the population of Swampscott and the total housing has only shown very slow growth over the decades and even decreasing in 2 of those. Unlike other suburbs on the North Shore, Swampscott didn't even see a bump in growth during the desegregation of Boston schools, where white residents left the city to relocate in the still segregated suburbs because the town was already discouraging people to move there through zoning bylaws. Additionally, other suburbs were easier to get to by car off the newly created Highway 128 from Boston. Over this period of limited housing production and population growth, housing prices and rents have only gone in one direction, and that is up. Only this past decade has seen some semblance of actual population and housing growth, which can be directly tied to the few instances of multifamily housing that have been allowed to be built here. Today, 85% of the land that is zoned for residential use in Swampscott only allows for single-family detached houses, with different areas mandating a minimum lot size of 10,000, 20,000, or even 30,000 square feet. A number of houses in town would be illegal to build today simply because they are sitting on lot sizes below the minimum zoned requirements. Today, a home is the largest asset the vast majority of Americans could ever hope to obtain, and a single-family detached house is a premium version of that asset. Therefore, it can be understandable why myths about increases or decreases in a home's value can be taken as gospel, and these beliefs, along with soaring home values, can make people a bit queasy anytime changes to the local housing landscape come up. Research has shown us that in Massachusetts, the racial segregation of community only decreases when they build multifamily housing above the 40B 10% threshold. We can also see that there is a strong positive correlation in the Boston metro area between just how white a community is and the percent of single-family houses the community has. Therefore, part of the solution to desegregating communities is to create more diverse housing options within those communities. Research has also shown that creating denser housing clusters in walkable neighborhoods with appropriate public open space, especially around transit centers, is a much better strategy at combating climate change than having the majority of the population live in single-family homes on large private lots. We also know that using cars a lot less is essential to saving the planet. Therefore, we can only achieve meaningful progress on climate change goals by changing the spaces we live in and how we move around in them. Stay tuned for part 3, where we take a look at how we fix this.